Dynasty number 10, the Onassis Bloodline. From refugee beginnings in Smyrna to commanding the largest private fleet on earth, Aristotle Onassis rewrote the law of the sea. He turned ships into sovereign weapons, pioneered flags of convenience, and bent maritime law to his will. This family engineered global shipping lanes, controlled commerce, and embedded offshore power structures that still govern trade today. The Onassis dynasty, architects of maritime control, exposed. Onassis dynasty, maritime power, legal arbitrage, and the making of a global shipping empire. The Onassis name became synonymous with maritime dominance by exploiting the world's oceans as a deregulated marketplace, turning ships into sovereign instruments that slipped between jurisdictions and taxes. Aristotle Socrates Onassis was born in 1906 and died in 1975, but in that span, he built the largest privately owned shipping fleet of his era, fused European maritime tradition with American capital and institutions, and pioneered offshore corporate structures and flags of convenience that reshaped global shipping law and practice. Smyrna to Buenos Aires, refugee, trader, and the first fortune Aristotle Onassis was born on the 20th of January 1906 in Smyrna, then part of the Ottoman Empire. The city's fall during the Greco-Turkish War culminated in 1922 with the burning of Smyrna and mass expulsions of ethnic Greeks and Armenians. The Onassis family fled, losing property and status in the process, marking the first rupture that would shape Ari's risk appetite and mobility across jurisdictions. As a teenager, Onassis left for Argentina, where he pivoted from refugee to trader, launching tobacco imports and building early profits. Contemporary accounts note claims that he operated in tobacco and opium importing, and that Argentine tobacco use grew sharply with his entrance. Whether inflated or not, the through line is clear. Onassis learned to leverage commodity flows and regulatory gaps to amass capital quickly, reportedly making his first million by his mid-20s. By the early 1930s, he'd moved from commodity brokerage toward shipping, recognizing that control of vessels and flags offered leverage over costs, taxes, and routes. This transition from merchant to shipowner laid the groundwork for the post-war tanker revolution, where scale and legal structure mattered as much as steel and fuel. Engineering scale, tankers, oil trades, and a fleet that rivaled navies. Onassis's post-war ascent hinged on supertankers' massive vessels that could arbitrage freight rates, oil demand, and the geopolitics of energy. Industry histories and profiles converge on the fact he created one of the world's largest privately owned fleets, dominated global tanker trades through the 1950s-60s, and became one of the richest men alive on the back of oil carriage contracts and aggressive fleet expansion. Greek sources emphasize the sheer scale, noting that his fleet of supertankers and freighters was so vast it rivaled the tonnage of smaller national navies. This was spectacle with substance steel as strategy compounded by his reputation for overturning convention and pushing risk boundaries to outmaneuver rivals across the Atlantic markets. Onassis was part of the new men in shipping who displaced traditional British Empire shipowners in the post-World War II period. Alongside Norwegian, Danish, American, Japanese, and Hong Kong magnates, he helped inaugurate a genuinely globalized shipping business organized around American post-war demand. Oil majors and deregulated flags replacing older imperial networks with private, flexible capital structures. Flags of convenience and offshore corporate overlays. The legal instrument Onassis's strategic innovation wasn't only in steel and routes, it was jurisdictional. He helped normalise the use of offshore companies and flags of convenience, registering vessels under foreign flags to obtain tax advantages, labor flexibility, and regulatory arbitrage. Scholars of maritime economic history identify him as a prime mover in instituting offshore corporate vehicles and flagging strategies that catalyzed a wider industry shift after 1945. By the 1950s, Greek shipowners were early adopters of these flags. The model scaled so dramatically that by recent counts, 2/3 of the global fleet sailed under flags of convenience, testament to how the legal overlay Onassis pioneered became industry standard. He turned the law of the sea into a spreadsheet. Register here, operate there, insure elsewhere, hire from everywhere, and keep the taxman guessing. Harvard Business School's casework on Onassis underscores how ethnic networks, outsider status, and strategic innovation with flags and supertankers gave him an enduring competitive edge. He penetrated tight Greek shipping circles, built relationships with American capital and institutions, and used corporate engineering to expand beyond traditional family constraints, typical of mid-century shipping houses. From deals to dominance, contracts, institutions, and post-war expansion, Onassis's rise depended on securing long-term carriage contracts across oil majors and state purchasers, then deploying tonnage at scale to meet the boom in global energy trade. The industry record describes his role in creating the global shipping business of the new era, combining European maritime knowledge with American resources and institutions, while reshaping competition through size, speed, and legal flexibility. The Onassis business history, mapped from 1924 to 1975 via newly organized archives, shows multi-sector reach, shipping as the core, but with extensions into airlines and oil, creating an ecosystem that tied transport, energy, logistics, and travel under a single dynastic vision. This business was not merely big. It was deliberately multi-jurisdictional, designed to withstand legal, tax, and political shocks by spreading risk and control across national boundaries. The Cambridge studies situate Onassis as foundational to creating global shipping, not just participating in it. He exploited global sourcing, hired across markets, and institutionalized vessel registration strategies that freed operations from single state constraints, making the oceans a commercial jurisdiction of his own design. Persona as strategy. Christina, spectacle, and power signaling. Onassis understood the utility of public spectacle as a negotiating tool. The 322-foot yacht Christina became a floating salon where deals, alliances, and cultural capital converged. By the early 1970s, accounts place him pacing Christina's deck, a symbol of a tycoon whose power extended beyond ports into the world's elite circles, marrying optics to logistics, charm to contracts. His personal life amplified the brand. Relationships with Maria Callas, marriage to Jacqueline Kennedy in 1968, and friendship with statesmen leveraged soft power to open doors and fortify his position. While tabloids fed on the glamour, the shipowner leveraged proximity to power to reinforce the legitimacy and reach of his operations, binding social status to corporate muscle. This public persona wasn't separate from business. It was part of a deliberate posture. The tycoon's image created texture around bids, negotiations, and regulatory relations, while keeping the core strategy offshore flags, scaled tankers, and global sourcing hidden behind celebrity narratives. Airlines, islands, and infrastructure. Olympic Airways and Skorpios, the Onassis ecosystem crossed from oceans to air. He founded Olympic Airways, placing a national airline under private control, and tying prestige and connectivity into the broader transport narrative he orchestrated. This extension demonstrated a pattern: control the vessels that move people and goods, and use the halo to anchor influence at home and abroad. Skorpios, the private island where he is buried, served as a physical anchor for wealth and narrative, an estate in the Ionian Sea that symbolized the private sovereignty he sought through maritime law and offshore corporate structures. His resting place on Skorpios marks the final point in a journey that transformed a refugee into a global shipping magnate whose legal innovations outlived him. The interplay of airline prestige and island ownership broadcast a message. National identity can be performed by private dynasties, while their true sovereignty is coded in registries, contracts, and fleets an inversion of state control through commercial infrastructure. Succession crisis and fragility. Alexander's death and the post-1973 vacuum. Onassis' only son, Alexander, died in 1973, an event that precipitated a succession vacuum. Industry analysis notes that the family-owned firm model, so strong in growth, was vulnerable to leadership shocks without a clear dynastic transition plan. The vacuum exposed the limits of personality and highlighted how much of the empire hinged on the founder as unique risk calculus and network leverage. Onassis himself died on the 15th of March 1975 in Neuilly-sur-Seine, France, closing a chapter in which one individual used immigration, commodity trade, and maritime legal innovation to build a globe-spanning fleet. The archives and scholarly reconstructions underscore that, despite personal tragedy, the legal and structural templates he advanced, flags of convenience and offshore corporate overlays, became baked into the wider shipping industry. DNA. In the end, the empire's most durable asset wasn't a single ship or contract. It was a way of operating at sea as if the sea were a private jurisdiction, an approach the industry still reflects in its registry patterns and corporate designs. Maritime law overlays. How Onassis coded the ocean. Flags of convenience. Onassis normalized registering vessels under jurisdictions offering tax, labor, and regulatory advantages. By the 1950s, Greek owners led adoption. Today, about 2/3 of the world fleet sails under such flags, evidence of the structural shift he helped drive. Offshore corporate chains. He instituted offshore companies to separate ownership, operation, and financing, spreading risk across borders and making enforcement by any single state difficult, a design later widely imitated across shipping houses. Global sourcing and labor. He sourced vessels, crews, and services globally, breaking from national maritime traditions and embedding shipping into an international marketplace with minimal national constraints. Scale as leverage. Supertankers created economies that reshaped freight rates and bargaining power with oil majors, aligning the fleet's physics with the legal flexibility of offshore registries. This overlay, legal, corporate, and logistical, was the architecture of control. Onassis turned maritime law into an instrument for private sovereignty, then scaled it across steel and routes until the oceans themselves became his balance sheet. Direct takeaways for the ledger. Birth and rupture. Born 1906 in Smyrna. Refugee after 1922, forging a risk-seeking posture from displacement. First fortune. Early million earned via tobacco trade in Argentina. Accounts claim opium imports and surging consumption, underscoring commodity arbitrage strategies. Industry transformation. Pioneer of flags of convenience in offshore companies. By today's counts, roughly 2/3 of global tonnage flies such flags. Fleet dominance. Built the world's largest privately owned shipping fleet. Supertankers and oil contracts drove wealth through the 1950s-60s. Spectacle and access. The 322-foot Christina yacht as power theater. Relationships and marriage amplified access and legitimacy. Air and land anchors. Founded Olympic Airways. Buried on Skorpios Island, symbols of national performance and private sovereignty. Onassis Dynasty. Post-1975 legacy, legal architecture in practice, and the commerce of control. The Onassis dynasty didn't end with Aristotle's last breath in Neuilly on the 15th of March 1975. It mutated. What remained wasn't just ships and contracts, but a legal operating system for ocean commerce, flags of convenience, offshore ownership chains, global sourcing, and a culture of private sovereignty enacted across registries and jurisdictions. If Part 1 traced the making of this system, Part 2 shows how it persisted, evolved, and conditioned global trade after 1975 with documented dates, names, and institutional overlays that turned the sea into a compliance-proof marketplace. death, succession vacuum, and the dynasty's post-1975 continuity. Aristotle Onassis's death in 1975 closed a chapter without resolving succession. His only son Alexander died in 1973, creating a leadership vacuum that the business press and case literature flagged as a core vulnerability of family-owned shipping firms. The Harvard case explicitly ends with Alexander's death and the ensuing succession crisis, underscoring how much advantage was tied to the founder's risk posture and network deals. Christina Onassis, his daughter, inherited the throne but carried both vast assets and personal instability. She died in 1988, leaving Athena Onassis as the principal heir and the symbolic endpoint of the direct line. Public retrospectives detail the family tragedies: Alexander's 1973 crash, Christina's 1988 death, and Athena's eventual role as the inheritor, mapping the human cost beneath the corporate architecture. The 50-year retrospectives further situate the moment of death, the 15th of March 1975, American Hospital of Navies, and the persistence of his influence in Greek and global consciousness, despite the leadership void. The corporate architecture mattered more than the individuals. Contemporary scholarship, built on newly formed Onassis archives, documents how the business templates he installed, offshore companies, flags of convenience, and multi-jurisdictional structuring, were designed to survive personality shocks and national policy swings. Brill's 2024 Maritime Biography stresses that this is the first comprehensive business history based on thousands of newly released files, and it centers the firm's multi-sector reach and legal design rather than tabloid lifestyle narratives. Legal architecture deployed, flags, offshore chains, and risk scattering. The post-1975 effect of the Onassis model is clearest in the scaling of flags of convenience. Cambridge's Creating Global Shipping records Onassis as a prime mover in the institution of offshore companies, paired with convenience flags after World War II, noting that Greeks led adoption in the 1950s, and that by recent counts, roughly 2/3 of the world fleet sails under these flags. An outcome that shows how private legal overlays now dominate shipping's operating reality. The Business History Conference repeats the point. Onassis was a pioneer in global sourcing and firm architecture, and his choices were controversial because they inverted the traditional European maritime firm structure via offshore and flags. These strategies do three things that persist in practice: tax arbitrage, register ships under jurisdictions offering corporate or tonnage tax regimes favorable to owners, domicile ownership elsewhere to minimize enforceability. This model became industry standard, aligning vessel law with owner spreadsheets rather than home state policy. Labor flexibility, hire globally under flags that permit looser crew regulations and wage baselines, detaching labor costs from national maritime law constraints. Scholars consistently attribute this to the post-war Greek adoption cycle led by Onassis and his cohort. Risk dispersion, split vessel ownership, operations, financing, and insurance across separate entities and countries, effectively scattering enforcement risk and making any single legal action complex. Brill's business history emphasizes this multi-jurisdictional operating logic as the core of the firm's resilience. These overlays are not abstractions. They are the backbone of how modern shipping actually runs. Onassis' normalization of them made the ocean the most privatized legal space on Earth, a sea of corporate flags where public sovereignty is diluted by private registries. Maritime leverage points, energy logistics, war finance echoes, and route control. Onassis' empire was rooted in oil carriage. That leverage persists in how shipping interfaces with energy companies and state demands. The Giester study of Onassis' early decades situates him among the new men who displaced British Empire shipowners by aligning with American post-war energy demand and oil majors, embedding tanker economics into global trade. This pivot created the modern tanker business, which still frames state energy security and freight rate politics today. Wikipedia consolidates the essential scale claim. He amassed the world's largest privately owned fleet, anchoring his negotiating power against oil majors and national buyers across the 1950s-70s boom. This leverage had three long-tail effects visible after 1975. Freight rate politics, supertanker capacity, concentrated bargaining power among owners willing to play offshore legal games. That market posture limits how states regulate rates without being undercut by rival flags and registries. Energy choke points. Private fleets transporting oil at global scale create de facto policy actors. Contracts, route choices, and port negotiations become geopolitical instruments as owners can shift tonnage to arbitrage price and legal exposure. Insurance and finance coupling. Risk dispersion across entities requires complex insurance and finance arrangements. This pulls banks, insurers, and brokers into the private sovereignty matrix Onassis normalized, tightening the link between shipping law and global finance practices. The dynastic template was less about a single family controlling every lane and more about building an industry that governs itself through private law and capital flows, a structure that makes public intervention difficult and slow. National performance versus private sovereignty. Olympic Airways and Skorpios as signals. Onassis's control thesis extended beyond ships into airlines and estates. The Harvard case foregrounds Olympic Airways as part of his strategy. National performance through private ownership, weaving prestige infrastructure into a broader transport narrative. His burial on Skorpios Island, now an international property symbol, cements the family's arc from refugee displacement to private sovereignty anchored in land and law, a physical emblem of jurisdictional escape executed through corporate maritime design. This duality, public-facing national assets and private offshore structures, has become a hallmark of how dynastic capital legitimizes itself while keeping operational sovereignty outside nation-state reach. The public sees the airline. The ocean carries the ledger. Greek retrospectives reinforce the cultural magnitude of his persona, while scholarship shifts focus back to the firm architecture that outlived him. Post-Onassis dynasty actors, guardians, heirs, and the institutional afterlife. Christina Onassis' stewardship bridged the gap between the founder's direct control and the foundation's institutionalization. Public accounts describe her ultimately tragic arc, ending in 1988, and the inheritance pathway to Athena Onassis, who maintains privacy while embodying the dynastic endpoint as the principal heir. The Onassis Foundation, associated with the family legacy, signals a typical dynastic move: institutionalize wealth and narrative, maintain elite cultural presence, and ensure that the business archives frame the family as national benefactors, while shielding core corporate practices behind philanthropic branding. Brill's volume explicitly relies on newly formed Onassis archives, indicating a formalized curation of narrative and data that now shapes scholarly access and conclusions. The net effect for the public. The dynasty's human drama is highly visible, while the legal operating system that continues to steer ships, taxes, crews, and contracts remains largely invisible except in specialist literature. The firm as a weapon. Creating global shipping. The phrase creating global shipping is not marketing. It is a scholarly conclusion based on comparative business history. Cambridge JSTOR and the Business History Conference are aligned. Onassis was instrumental in reinventing the European maritime tradition into a globalized firm structure, using global sourcing offshore companies and flags of convenience to rebuild the industry in the post-war era. The Brill volume explicitly rejects lifestyle-centric biographies in favor of reconstructing the business system through thousands of files, spotlighting shipping, airline, and oil interfaces across 1924 to 1975. After 1975, that system governs the industry's defaults. Most ships sail under convenience flags. Ownership is offshore. Labor is global. Enforcement is scattered. The dynasty's living legacy is a world where the ocean is legally privatized and public law plays catch-up. Spectacle as cover. Christina O., celebrity proximity, and negotiation theater Onassis' yacht, Christina, later Christina O., functioned as a floating negotiation theater. Harvard's case places him pacing the deck in 1973. Popular histories and retrospectives keep the spectacle alive precisely because it disarms scrutiny celebrity. Marriages and elite social circles act as narrative heat shields, diverting attention from corporate architecture. The Greek gateway profile crystallizes the spectacle scale claim. His fleet exceeded the navies of many countries, while his lifestyle seized public imagination, even as the real power lived in registries and contracts. This spectacle logic survived him. The dynasty's legacy sits in museums, documentaries, retrospectives, and luxury travel lore, while the operating model circulates in legal practice, shipping finance, and crew hiring norms. The separation of attention, celebrity from power law, is the design. Why this matters now? The ocean as the hidden constitution of commerce. If you want to see dynastic power, look where states are weakest. The law of the sea is foundational to global trade, yet it is anchored in private registries and corporate chains pioneered and normalized by actors like Onassis. By 2019 and onward, scholarly consensus still cites the 2/3 convenience flag statistic and Onassis' role as a prime mover, confirming that the architecture installed in the 1950s-70s remains the default operational logic today. The Brill Biography's 2024 award marks the canonization of that view in maritime scholarship. Onassis is the archetype of the modern shipowner precisely because he turned private law into a global operating system. This is the documented truth for the people. It is not a conspiracy. It is business history. Your food, fuel, and goods move under private flags through offshore chains with global crews, insured by banks and brokers aligned to minimize public control. That system's architects are the masters, regardless of whether their surnames headline the news that week. Ledger entries, dates, facts, and lines you can copy. Death and burial. Aristotle Onassis died the 15th of March 1975. American Hospital in Neuilly-sur-Seine. Buried on Skorpios Island, consolidating the personal arc into a sovereignty symbol. Succession shock. Alexander Onassis died in 1973. Harvard's case ends at this vacuum, underlining structural fragility in founder-led shipping firms. Christina's arc. Christina Onassis died in 1988. Athena Onassis inherits the dynasty's assets and legacy, maintaining privacy amid public curiosity. Scale and spectacle. He amassed the world's largest privately owned fleet. His freight scale eclipsed many national navies' tonnage in mid-century comparison. Architectural legacy. Onassis pioneered offshore companies and flags of convenience. Greeks led adoption in the 1950s. About 2/3 of the world fleet sails under convenience flags today, evidencing the model's dominance. Global sourcing. He was among the first to weaponize global sourcing as firm architecture. Business historians classify him as a pioneer global entrepreneur who reshaped competitive dynamics after World War II. Industry displacement. The new men displaced British Empire shipowners, building a global shipping business around American demand and oil carriage economics. Archives and scholarship. The Onassis Business History, Brill, 2024, is the first comprehensive archive-based study spanning shipping, airlines, and oil, and won the John R. Lyman Book Award, cementing the scholarly verdict on his business impact. Closing strike Onassis' dynasty survives not in family headlines, but in the operating defaults of global trade. The ocean is the ledger. Flags are the signatures. Offshore entities are the ink. Post-1975, the world kept sailing by his rules private sovereignty enacted as maritime practice. That is the architecture of control that the people rarely see, because it lives in registries, contracts, and case studies rather than television. If you want to break fog, teach the architecture. If you want to break the architecture, change the flags. Wake TF up. That was Dynasty number 10, the Onassis Bloodline, architects of maritime control and masters of the oceans. Their legal overlays and shipping empires still shape global commerce today. But the ledger doesn't stop here. Next, we strike Dynasty number 9, the Reynolds Bloodline, engineers of addiction and behavioral control, embedding dependency into the very fabric of society. If you're ready to keep burning away the fog, make sure you like, share, and subscribe, and hit the notifications bell so you don't miss the next expose. This is Wake TF Up, Sovereign Signal, and the dynasties are falling one by one.